That's much better.
Good.
That's much better. And sound check. Can you say something?
Okay, I would say greetings on this Monday morning. Is that coming through? Can you hear me?
Yes, it is.
All right. Good.
Okay. All right. So you ready to go?
I am. Yes. Where are you calling from? I know you're in Washington, but
yeah, I'm actually on the campus of the University of Maryland, where I work. I teach. I'm also the assistant director for the Black Cultural Center here on campus.
Okay.
And we'll talk about that offline, afterwards. But we're trying to look at. I was going to ask you about, trying to bring you up here. Maybe later this semester, and if not, then beginning of next semester, if that's possible, to have you come up and do a lecture for our students.
Sure.
Yeah.
There was a time when I was coming to Washington on a regular basis, and if that starts up again, I'd be very happy about it. I've got a lot of relatives in Washington.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great. Yeah, we'd be thrilled.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'm gonna start. I'm gonna count down from 3 to 1, and then I'll open up. 3.
Ellen.
Pull this way. Pull this that way.
Okay. All right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's wait till she's.
Yeah, that's better. Okay. Okay, but nobody can walk behind me too much. Okay. All right. 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to another edition of Critical Insight on Your World News. I'm your host, Solomon Kamajan, and today it's our pleasure to be joined by Dr. Charles Finch. Dr. Charles Finch III is former director of international health at Morehouse School of Medicine. In 1970, he is a 1971 graduate from Yale University, and 1976 graduate of Jefferson Medical College. He's the author of numerous books, including Echoes, The Old Darkland, Themes from the African Eden, which is a book that I had the pleasure of reading, several years ago, and it's left an indelible impact in terms of my understanding and development of understanding regarding numerous things of antiquity Africa. And so I just want to welcome you to Critical Insight, Dr. Finch. Thank you. It's an honor.
Thank you, Solomon, for inviting me this morning.
So I want to hit the ground running. I'd like to just kind of start off. If you can, tell our viewers and our listeners, how did you get so involved in the studies of ancient Africa, myriad aspects of the studies of ancient Africa? How did you get into that? You're a medical doctor.
Yeah, that's a frequent question, almost a routine question. How can you, a medical doctor, be interested in these subjects? Well, my first interest was always history. Okay, and I was a history major in college, and I came of age, shall we say, in the 60s. Well, I think most people have an idea of what that means. It was the rise and the launching of what you might call the Black consciousness movement, the Black power movement, the Black nationalist movement. So a lot of us who, especially if we have a historical frame of mind, a historical bent, we took that consciousness, if you will, into our study of history, or my interest in history. Now, I had studied history in college, or I should say majored in history in college, but there was nothing in my history major that taught me much of anything about the history of African people beyond the last 500 years. So I had to, my road to Damascus was actually the book by J.A. Rogers. When I say the road to Damascus, that light, that sudden burst of light that shows you, oh, there's a whole nother world out there, culturally and historically speaking, was World's Great Men of Color by J.A. Rogers. And then in 1971, I started it wasn't that systematic, but I just began to collect books mostly in bookstores in New York, Weiser's bookstore in New York, and Black bookstores around the country. Began a systematic study of, I created a university in which I was a private university in which I was both pupil and professor. That started in 1971. That even started even before I went to medical school. Now, I came up in a family where my father was a physician, and my mother, from the time I was a young child, pointed me toward medicine in a way that could not be denied. So I knew I was always going to go into medicine, but history was going to be my parallel interest, my parallel vocation. And for 10 years I studied privately. And there was a time when I'm saying study, I collected books, books by eventually Ivan Van Sertima, Shehanta Diop, Gerald Massey, others that I can name. And there was a time when you thought, well, you're the only one out there doing this. It's that kind of misconception when you're out there doing it by yourself. You don't know other people that are doing it. But then in I think it was 1981, trying to remember, it was 1981, I was actually in San Francisco attending the wedding of one of my brothers. And I went to the Marcus bookstore, the famous Marcus bookstore in San Francisco. And I saw this gold covered periodical, the Journal of African Civilizations, edited by Ivan Van Sertima. I'd already knew about Ivan Van Sertima on the basis of the Journal of African, They Came Before Columbus, excuse me, his signature work, They Came Before Columbus. I took the book, I took out the subscription page, wrote a check, and sent a letter to him, sent the subscription page to him. And I guess I must have said something about the fact that I was a physician when I sent him this letter, but that was that. I wasn't expecting anything from it. Almost a week from the day I actually sent the subscription in, the phone rang. I picked up the phone, and at the other end says, "This is Ivan Van Sertima." Well, I nearly dropped the phone. I said, I almost didn't believe what I was hearing. He says, "Well, I was very impressed by your letter, your interest, you're a physician, and I would like someone to write a history article on the history of medicine in the Black world." Whoa, that was the launch. Obviously I stammered my agreement, my assent. I was happy to do it. Spent the next 4 to 6 months actually studying researching in the Duke Medical Library. We were living in Raleigh at the time, Raleigh, North Carolina. Duke University has a nice medical history library, believe it or not, history section in their library. Anyway, end up writing an article called the African Background of Medical Science. That was my very first article I ever wrote that was published. With 6 months later, I was invited by LeGrand Clegg and Runoko Rashidi to speak at Compton College. So that was also 1982. The rest, as they say, is history. So that was very rapidly, that was a concise way in which I began my career in writing and speaking on these subjects in ancient Africa, while at the same time pursuing my profession. And of course, interestingly enough, that first article brought those two things together, right? Medicine, which is my livelihood and my profession, and my historical interest. And as I say, I eventually ended up publishing 8 articles for Ivan Van Sertima in his anthologies, and 2 books and actually 3 books and a pamphlet. There's a manuscript waiting to be published right now. Ever since. So I know that was a lot to say in a short period of time. I spoke a little fast, but that I think gives some kind of background as to how I got to this place.
Appreciate it. The context and the deep context is very, very much appreciated. Next question I wanted to ask you, speaking of history, we know that human life began in the continent of Africa. My question for you is a 2-part question. What did those early human beings look like? And then how did other so-called races or colors of people come to be, after their migration into places like Europe and Asia? How did that happen? How did dark-skinned people become white?
Shehanta Diop was the one who kind of pointed me in that direction. In other words, looking into the whole question of human origins. We know that the first pre-human hominids are found in Africa, going back about 6.5 million years ago in Chad. Also in the eastern third of Africa, all the way down to South Africa. And I take the bioanthropological evolutionary view of human origins. Other people have another idea. I'm not trying to get into that debate, but I take the bioanthropological evolutionary view of human origins. So those hominids, those early hominids, 6.5 million years ago in Africa, over time evolved to the point where about 300,000 years ago, what we call Homo sapiens, or more appropriately, anatomically modern humans first appeared on the planet, also in Africa. They don't seem to have left Africa for another 200,000 years, at least not in significant numbers. Now, let's not say individuals or small groups did, but not enough to have made a difference in terms of populating the Earth. That started to happen about 100,000 years ago. And they went across the isthmus of what we did call the Isthmus of Suez into what is now Syria, Jordan, Palestine, all the way across what we call the Middle East and into India and Asia. And eventually, that was the first route of migration. But then there was another later route of migration into what we today call Europe. Now, why didn't they go into Europe earlier? Because Europe was just as close. And it was just because the glaciers at that time were covering most of habitable Europe, all the way down to about 50,000 BC, okay? 50 or 60,000 BC. So it was only when there was a gradual warming that allowed human populations to move into what we call Europe, Spain, southern France mostly, that you saw significant numbers of humans moving into that area. Now, these were black-skinned human beings, okay? But what happened after about 40,000 years ago, the glaciers came back. The sky became cold, overcast, wintry, Arctic almost, in nearly all of Europe. Now, here's the problem. Human beings need sunlight for the production of vitamin D. Why do they need vitamin D? You don't have any vitamin D, your bones get soft and break. That's what causes rickets, okay, or osteomalacia, rickets. You have to have vitamin D in order to survive as a human being. Now, what happens with black people is that they've got melanin in their skin, okay? That actually allows them to survive in climates where there's a lot of sunlight, direct sunlight, as in Africa or other tropical regions. But that black skin prevents the sunlight from getting down to the dermis, we call the dermis layers, and causing skin cancer. But it also screens out the sunlight needed for the production of vitamin D. But there's so much sunlight, so much of the time in Africa, that enough sunlight gets through the melanin layer to produce enough vitamin D for the bones of black African peoples, which is the reason why in Africa you don't see much rickets. You don't see it, okay? But it happens, something changes now when you get into Arctic Europe, because Europe was basically an Arctic environment in the time I'm talking about, 40,000 years ago. Now that black skin becomes a liability, evolutionarily speaking. They had been there for about 10,000 years or so. Now there's a sudden climactic change that turns Europe into an ice age, another ice age, this third or fourth ice age. And now there isn't much sun available. So black skin is actually a liability in that environment. So if you're going, so what would have happened, some significant numbers would have migrated outward and back to the warmer climates, but there were those who stayed. And those who stayed, if they were going to survive, they would have had to underwent a transformation that allowed their skin to have changed color in order to lose the black pigment, or most of it, and allow, therefore, more sunlight to penetrate the skin layer that allows vitamin D to be produced, because most of your vitamin D is produced from interaction with the sun, okay? We now have exogenous sources of vitamin D, like in milk and that sort of thing, but most of the time it's in your interaction with the sun. Now, how did that happen? How did they lose their skin? Well, it was it's simple in one way. It was basically a biological mutation. One of the things that we know now is that Africans have the highest rate of albinism in the world. In other words, albinism is a mutation of one of the 4 genes that codes for skin color. And if there's a mutation of that gene, then you lose your ability to produce melanin. And Africans actually have the highest rate of mutation that gives you albinism. So there would have been people who have albinism, or albinoids as I call them, because they may not have been totally albino, but mostly albino. And those would have been the people who would have been better adapted to this ice age Arctic environment in Europe from about 40,000 years ago to 30,000 years ago, or 25,000 years ago. And they would have been able to survive. The limited sun would have been enough because their skin now was did not have any more melanin, they would have been able to survive under those conditions of limited sunlight in a cold Arctic environment. And they are the ones that did. Hence, the people we today call the Caucasoids, and Caucasoids are basically white people, Europeans. Now, it's interesting. There is a line of female figurines. We call the so-called Grimaldi. There's another name for them, Grimaldi figurines. They're clearly Africoid figurines. They go back 40,000. And they start from France, and they go all the way across into Russia. That's where you see these figurines. And that's the line where that was the glacier line. That's the glacier line. And so the evolution of the Caucasoid is above that line, both probably in France, possibly even in Russia, what we today call Russia, Caucasoid. Anyway, again, very rapidly, that's how the people we today call Caucasians, evolutionarily speaking, would have come into being.
Thank you, appreciate that. There's a lot of regarding the place that you're going to be going soon, and that's Egypt.
Yes.
And feel free, after this question, feel free to incorporate your trip into the response. But there's a lot of what I would describe as purposeful mythology and obfuscation regarding Egypt. You see Hollywood films, and they portray ancient Egyptians as
don't get me started.
Skin tone as Charlton Heston or Brad Pitt.
Oh, wait a minute! Don't forget the Mummy. Don't forget this recent monstrosity, the Mummy movies. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, not exactly. You've seen with Ben Stiller, all these different Mummy movies. They become unwrapped, and after they're unwrapped, these mummies are pale white. Given that context, I wanted to ask you a question regarding ancient Egypt, which was referred to as Kemet. What is the literal translation of Kemet? Why did people during that time refer to that place as Kemet? And why is that mythology? Why are these Hollywood films untrue?
Like I said, don't get me started. We could spend the rest of the interview just talking on that subject. But anyway, the ancient Egyptians named for their own country. They had actually 2 or 3 names, but the principal name was Kemet. It means literally the black land, because Kem or Kam is the strongest word in their language for black or blackness. So Kemet means the black land. Now, what happened was that the Egyptologists, the 19th, 20th century, say, well, that just refers to the black mud of Egypt that is on either side of the Nile after the flood, except for one thing. The ancient Egyptians called themselves Kemiyu, which means the black people. All right. So these are the people, and they got to understand too, there's some other subtle, interesting aspects when you look at their language. Their word for south was Kenti, K-A, we kind of write it out, K-H-E-N-T-I, Kenti. It's also their word for first, or chief, or up. So for them, the first land, or the chief land, or even the origin land is the South, because that's where they came from, the South, okay? Now, they always said that their, what do you want to call it? Their sacred land, or the land of the Neters, Ta-Neter, the Ta-Neteru, the land of the gods. Some people say it was what we call Punt. Punt would have been Somalia. And the others say it might have been Uganda or the Great Lakes region of Africa. Recently, in the last 2 months, they have done mitochondrial DNA studies on several Egyptian mummies, and they found something very interesting. Their DNA is the same as the people that you find in Uganda today. It's Ugandan DNA in mummies that are 4,000 years old. Wow. Okay? So it becomes absolutely absurd. It's beyond absurd. It's almost, if you think of it as a cultural war, it's almost like Holocaust denial. It's literally whitewashing the ancient Egyptians, taking when you make a mistake, when you're typing something out and you make a mistake and you get some white out and you just white it out. That's what has been done to the history of black people, African people worldwide. It has been whited out, especially when it comes to Kemet, especially when it comes to Egypt. Why? Because Egyptologists as a group, not all of them, want Egypt desperately. They want it. They want it more than they want Greece or Rome. Why? Because everything that is Greek or Roman is ultimately, or let's not even just that, ancient Hebrew, for that matter, Assyrian, anything that you can name in that part of the world. But let's just stick with Greco-Roman, is ultimately comes from the Nile Valley. Name something, I will show you its Nile Valley antecedents. Math, science, philosophy, religion, mythology, symbolism. It all comes from ancient Egypt, and the Greeks knew it. The Greeks were very proud of themselves, you know. They were very chauvinistic, very proud of themselves, and they had a kind of a superiority complex about every other people except two people, the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. They never ever tried to project themselves above those two people. And they were very clear about where their civilization came from. And there are about 10 surviving references in the Greek literature about the race and color of the ancient Egyptians, without exception, black, starting with Herodotus, 450 BC. He says the Colchians are people in the Black Sea, in what is now Russia, or the Caucasoid, or Azerbaijan. That's where Colchis was, excuse me. Like the Egyptians and Ethiopians, were black-skinned and woolly-haired. Herodotus was talking about the Colchians, but when we made a comparison to them, because they were black-skinned and woolly-haired, he had to go to the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. This is Herodotus. There's a famous anecdote, and this is told by William Leo Hansberry about a famous Harvard Egyptologist named Reisner, who was trying to, again, this was back in the 20s, who was trying to say that, you know, the ancient Egyptians couldn't have been anything else but Caucasian people. And William Leo Hansberry raised his hand and says, well, that's not what Herodotus says. Herodotus says these were black people. And Ryder says, well, I don't consider Herodotus an authority. Whereupon William Leo Hansberry said, Herodotus was there. You weren't. Herodotus spent 7 months in Egypt. He wasn't just talking about hearsay. He isn't talking about what he heard. He traveled from the Nile Delta all the way down to Syene, or the southern boundary of Egypt. 7 months. He went the entire length of the country. He saw those people. So he was talking as an eyewitness, not as somebody who was just repeating hearsay. So on that score, on that one point, Herodotus is an unassailable authority. And in 450 AD, now this is late in Egyptian history. This is now nearly 4,000 years since the beginning of Egyptian history. Even then, by this time, Egypt is kind of closing, is at nearly the end of its history. Foreigners it's already been invaded by Assyria. Soon it was under Persian domination at that time. Okay, would soon be under Greek and Macedonian domination. Still, black-skinned and woolly-haired. This is the testimony of Herodotus, and all the other Greeks after that who had anything to say about the race and color of the ancient Egyptians said exactly the same thing.
So, and what is this trip that you're taking?
Yes, I call it the Gift of the Nile tour. That's going to be my 9th tour to ancient Kemet, July 24th to August 4th. That will be, you know, a study tour. That's what it is, a study tour. We not only see all the major sites, but we also lecture at night on the history of ancient Egypt. In fact, I know I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to anyway. It's all right. This is it. I don't know if you can see it very well. Yeah. Okay, I don't know if it's that, you know, but this is it. And I don't want to obscure my face too long, but here's the difference about this trip. We did this the first time last summer. Anthony Karak Browder, we call him Karakamoon, is the co-director of an excavation of a temple tomb on the west bank of the Nile, right across the river from Luxor, with Elena Pishikova, co-director. He's the first Black man in history, as far as I know, who has been a director of any kind of any archaeological dig in Egypt itself. Okay, and they have discovered some fascinating things at about Karakomun's temple. It's not just a, it's not just a temple or a tomb, it's a temple tomb. It's a tomb and a temple both. And it's from the 25th dynasty. That's the so-called Ethiopian dynasty, about 715 BC. And there's another temple tomb right next to it called Karabaskin, and they're excavating these things. Just before the end of this season last year in September, they went through a wall. It was a dirt, well, it was more like it wasn't like a constructed wall, it was like the surrounding ditch, and they just kind of dug in through there. They opened up a room, and it was a room full top to bottom with mummies and sarcophagi that had never been discovered before. And when we go this time, we're going to see all of that up close and personal. We're going to see these, we're going to go visit these archaeological sites. We're going to see what's going on. We're going to see all that's what's happening right under our very, and there are people who went with us last year and who stayed just so they could be part of this experience. So it isn't just seeing the normal sites that you usually see. And we will do that, okay, from July 24th to August 4th. But we're going to spend 2 days at those two excavation sites. In South Asasif, which is right across the river from Luxor, on the west bank. That's what makes the tour last year and this year different from other study tours I've done before.
Is it possible for people to sign up for this?
Oh my goodness, yes. You can get to the gift. You can go to the website, as you mentioned, www.charlessfinch.com. Just if you can just remember my full name, Charles S. Finch, in lowercase letters, you should be able to get to it. www.charlessfinch.com. There's a tag for tours, and you can go right to it. So yes, we are welcoming all comers. But and so there are a lot of study tours that are going to Kemet. Have been since early 80s, still doing it. There's about 2 or 3 or 4 going this year. But I said what makes our study tour somewhat unique is this visit to this active excavation site under the of which Anthony Browder is one of the directors. He's really making history is what he's doing. He's a friend. He's also a friend of mine, but you know,
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And he's right there in Washington too.
That's right. That's right. It's right. I've been on his tour of Washington. Yes, he's doing amazing work and has been so for a while. How vast you mentioned the Nile Valley civilization? How vast? What kind of geographic area are we talking about?
Yeah, I wish I have a map for that. When we're talking about Nile Valley civilization, we're not just talking about Egypt. We're really talking about Egypt and Kush, Kemet and Kush. Okay, though they are like they are, shall we say, there is a geocultural unity in the exact same way that you would think of England and Wales, for example, Germany and Austria, Italy and Sicily. Now, each one of those geographical designations are variations of a great big cultural complex that fundamentally shares history, ethnicity, language, religion, with you might say a local or regional variation. Kemet and Kush, Egypt and Ethiopia, that's what they called Kush in the ancient times, exactly like that. So when you're talking about Nile Valley civilization, you're talking about the Delta or the Mediterranean all the way down almost to Khartoum, where the White Nile and the Blue Nile come together. The White Nile comes from the Great Lakes region of Uganda, mostly, or Uganda, Kenya, and the Blue Nile comes from Lake Tana in Ethiopia, and they meet right just south of what is Khartoum, or just north of Khartoum. So the Nile Valley civilization encompasses most of that area from the Mediterranean almost down to Khartoum. And it encompasses both Kemet and Kush, Egypt and Ethiopia together. fused. In fact, there were 13 Ethiopian, Herodotus says there were 13 Ethiopian pharaohs of Kemet. Not just the pharaohs who obviously had come from Cush. That doesn't include all the pharaohs whose mothers were Nubian or Cushitic. There were a lot of those too. And so there was, and also one other thing, since you got me started, I'm going to get it. When you look at from the time of the dynastic period, all the way up until about the time of the Assyrian conquest, whenever Egypt was on the verge of social, political, cultural collapse, the forces to reintegrate and reorganize and reestablish Egypt as a viable civilization always came from the South. Always. Again and again. The classic example of that is the so-called Middle Kingdom. The founder of Middle Kingdom was Amenemhet, who and the Egyptian annals says he was a son of a woman from Ta-Seti. Ta-Seti was the ancient Egyptian name for what we today call Nubia. So he was basically a Nubian. And he is the one that pulled Egypt finally out of its not just its because it was coming out of what they used to call they still call the intermediate period, out of a period of political and social upheaval, and reintegrated it into the beginnings of the Middle Kingdom, which is considered one of the highest summits of Egyptian civilization. It was one of the three, some say four, but certainly at least three golden ages. The Middle Kingdom was one, and Amenemhet is the one who inaugurated that, and he came from the south, as others before him had.
Thank you. I have a heck of a question for you right now, and forgive me for about to frustrate you again. We were talking about the Hollywood mythology, which got you going. I'm about to get you going again with this question. You are a medical doctor by training, and from my understanding, medical doctors, part of their, entrance into the medical field, you have to take something called the Hippocratic Oath.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, because it's perplexing to some folks who are new to this information. This guy, Hippocrates, which is what the Hippocratic Oath is based on, he's known as, roundly, referred to as the father of medicine. But there was a guy before him, 2,000 years before him, by the name of Imhotep.
3,000 years before him, but go ahead.
Before him by the name of Imhotep, which Hippocrates refers to himself as a child of Imhotep. Can you tell us, can you close the ranks on this perplexing situation, and also delve into the African origins of medicine?
Oh yeah, that's a book, by the way, with that last question. First of all, Hippocratic Oath was not written by Hippocrates himself. It was written several hundred years after his life by people who were his followers. He never wrote the Hippocratic Oath. Never ever had the temerity to call himself the father of medicine. He never did. Others, much later in Europe, did. All right. Now, the thing about Hippocrates is very interesting. He was born and raised on the island of Kos. His father and grandfather were both priests of Asclepios. Asclepios was the Greek god of medicine. So Hippocrates was raised in the temple of Asclepios, therefore grew up worshiping and venerating the Greek god of medicine, Asclepios. Well, who was Asclepios? The ancient Greeks identified him with Imhotep, because Sir William Osler called Imhotep the first figure of a physician who stands out clearly from the myths of antiquity. Now, by the way, I do not follow the short chronology. So what you're going to hear from me has nothing to do with the short chronology, has nothing to do with Egypt's dynastic period beginning 3100 BC. That's a ridiculous date. So that my dates for Imhotep are about 3700 BC. So that was, good Lord, that was more than 3,000 years before Hippocrates. But see, Imhotep was the first universal genius, I call him the first universal genius of whom we had any knowledge. He was a designer and builder of the step pyramids of Saqqara, the first great edifice in stone ever erected by human hands. He was a chief astronomer under the pharaoh Djoser and his prime minister. But even in spite of all of these fabulous accomplishments, especially the step pyramid of Saqqara, he won greater renown as a physician, did Imhotep. Within 100 years after his death, he was venerated as a physician in Egypt, and then by about 600 BC, he was deified as a god, as a god of medicine, both in Egypt and in Greece. And so for the Greeks, Imhotep was Asclepios. So Hippocrates grew up worshiping and venerating basically Imhotep. So it's impossible. Oh, that's just one thing. If you look at the Edmund Smith papyrus, there are 8 medical papyri, fragments mostly, not in completely have survived down from antiquity. The two most famous ones are the Edmund Smith papyrus and the Ebers papyrus. Both of them date back originally to what we call the Old Kingdom. So when you look at them, and they've been published and translated and published, especially the Edwin Smith papyrus, translated by James Henry Breasted. And when you consider the figure of Imhotep, it becomes absolutely impossible, nonsensical, absurd to refer to Hippocrates as the father of medicine, any more than you can refer to Herodotus as the father of history. All right. Now remember, in fairness to these individuals, these historical individuals, they themselves never gave themselves those kind of titles. But that was titles given to them much later. All right. So that's the thing about the Edmund Smith papyrus. In the Edmund Smith papyrus, they give you what are the surgical treatments for various kinds of injury to the head and the brain, which shows that they had mapped the topography of the brain and knew what part of the brain controlled what neurological functions.
Wow.
This is 5,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Wow. And they also used what do you want to call it? They also used fungus. They would take molds off of bread to treat infections, right? I said, well, so why is that significant? What do you think produces mold? What do you think molds produce?
Yeah, exactly.
Penicillin. Penicillin comes from molds and fungi. So they were. There's another people in the Sudan who apparently were using a natural form of tetracycline. Wow. Right. So even we think of as antibiotics has an ancient history that traces back to ancient Africa. Neurosurgery can trace back to ancient Africa. Anatomy and physiology, especially cardiac physiology, because they used to measure the pulse, did the ancient Egyptian physicians. Herodotus never did that as an aid to diagnosis. That's in that's in the first, remember that first article I mentioned, the African background of medical science, and we go into that. And there's a book, in fact, called The African Background of Medical Science that was published by Carnac House. I don't know if it's that easy to get anymore. Carnac House is actually in England. And I almost hate to tell you to go on Amazon.com because they may want to charge you $500 for that book. It's just a soft cover of books. But that's a whole other thing. Yeah. But my point is that it had, and I also published that article in Van Sertima's journal, and it got published in Blacks in Science. So the article is here and there, okay? But so we go into all of that. But if you're talking about the beginnings of modern medicine, and even the Greeks say so, medicine as we understand the term, both healing and medicine, as a discipline, as a coherent, comprehensive, scientific discipline, vocation even, you're talking about Nile Valley.
Can we also say the same, that Africa has very rich, deep histories and origins in regards to math and science as well?
That's where it all starts there. Oh, goodness, it's just the math in particular. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, again, is not complete, but in the Rhind mathematical papyrus, you see that the ancient Egyptians not only had mastered numbers, arithmetic, plane geometry, and even trigonometry. It doesn't stop there. Trigonometry wasn't supposed to be invented until Hipparchus did so about 100 years before Christ. But there's also a what is this? There is a drawing in ancient Egypt. This is back in the Old Kingdom now. We're going back 5,000 years. And they're showing in this drawing that the ancient Egyptians knew how to find the area beneath a curve. Anybody who knows anything about calculus, and my oldest son told me this, he was a math major. He says, when you can find the area underneath a curve, that is what happens in integral calculus. Now, we're talking about, now you say that's just one little, because that's just the only thing you see, but it's very suggestive. It shows you how something very simple like that can lead to some really astonishing conclusions. They know how to, if you can find an area underneath the curve, that is called integration, and that's the basis of integral calculus. I didn't know that until he pointed it out. My son did. He lives in Washington. He lives there in Washington too, by the way.
Wow. Oh, okay. All right. Thank you so much. I just have a couple more questions, and I thank you for your time. I know your time is very, very valuable, and we appreciate the time you spent today. I just have a couple more questions for you, and that's you mentioned math and sciences and medicine. I've heard you on different lectures I've seen on YouTube and in your readings mention some remarkable people known as Dogon.
Oh my goodness.
And you know, we hear a lot about Galileo and all the things that Galileo did, but these folks were doing things that Galileo could literally only dream of doing. Who were the Dogon, and what are some of the astrological just accomplishments that these people were able to do?
The man who did the most systematic work among the Dogon is a man named, well, he's no longer living, Marcel Griot, who started working with them in the 1920s. And they kind of vetted him for 25 years before they started revealing to him. And he used to come back every year, kept asking questions, kept investigating, and they would let him, they would tell him a little more, and a little more, and a little more. And finally, apparently, they got together, the elders did, and decided, well, let's give him kind of a comprehensive view of the Dogon system. And that ended up that they did do that. And it resulted in two books, Conversation with Agatameli and The Pale Fox. Now, the things that are in this Dogon system almost defy imagination. First of all, they, like the ancient Egyptians, they were very focused on the star system Sirius, which is the Alpha Centauri, I think, is the closest star to our solar system, but Sirius is the next closest star, a mere 9 light years away. That's why it's so bright in the sky, okay? But it was discovered in 1862, and due to perturbations of the orbit, that Sirius had to have a companion. But it wasn't until 1915, that they realized that this was what they call a white dwarf star. All right, what is a white dwarf star? A white dwarf star is a star that is very old. At the end of its age, after about 10 billion years, a star starts to expand to become what they call a red giant. But then it can no longer sustain that size, and it just explodes into a fiery holocaust, and it collapses down to a white dwarf, which is incredibly dense and heavy. So in other words, if I had a half teaspoon of white dwarf matter here, I couldn't hold it. It would go right down through the table, through the floor, and through the earth because it's so dense. Half teaspoon of it, okay? All right? Now, and that white dwarf is what controls the orbit of Sirius. And it's both a companion. We see the Dogon knew all that about the fact that it was a white dwarf and heavy, the fact that it had an orbit around Sirius, and they knew it without telescopes. And you can never see, hardly ever see a white dwarf without telescopes. All right. Not only that, they say that the sun turns on its axis, which it does. And he mentioned the Earth revolves around the sun, which it does. Now remember, I don't think I said this, but let me go back. Let me step back a little bit. The Dogon say they now live along the Bandiagara cliffs in southeastern Mali. They say they began their migrations from the northeast 1,400 years Well, now it's almost 1,500 years, about 1,000, almost 1,500 years ago, 15 centuries ago. All right, that would have been about 550 AD. And when you start looking at the details of their system in the Book of Pale Fox, you realize these people came from Kemet, because there's too many exact correspondences to the elements in their system as you find in the ancient Egyptian system. All right. Now, they say that the sun revolves around this on its axis, which it does. The earth revolves around the sun. The sun and the earth in this solar system revolve around the center of this galaxy, and that this galaxy revolves around the center of a supercluster of galaxies. And the Dogon described all of that. They, you've heard me. I haven't had a chance to even talk about the whole phenomenon of the precession and the great year, of the 26,000 year precessional cycle, the great year, caused by the fact that there are two axes of the earth. There's a straight up and down axis, and then there's a tilted axis, or the celestial axis of the earth. Why? Because the earth axis tilts from straight because of the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon. That causes the Earth's axis to wobble around a invisible axis that is straight up and down. The axis, so the two axes, one axis is revolving around the other, but that takes 26,000 years to complete. And the ancient Egyptian and the ancients in ancient Africa created a calendar around that 26,000 years. Now, the Dogon described the exact same thing. So you start, and it just goes on and on like that with the Dogon. They don't have any instruments. They don't even have a written language that they know about. If they do, it's secret. They don't have any formal mathematics that we know about. All right. And yet they have scientific information of such a high level that there was a MIT physicist or mathematician named Carl Brecher. I don't know if his last name was Brecher, who, when learning all these things about the Dogon, said, and this is a direct quote, "They have no business knowing any of this."
Appreciate that. That's a lot to chew on, mentally. Really appreciate that, and I hope our audience really starts to delve into this work, and by delving into your work, which we're going to get into right after this next question. My last question for you is, cover math, sciences, medicine, a range of topics. My last question to you is the African origins of religion. The religion. We look at Akhenaten and the concept of monotheism and so forth. What are the African origins of religion, and also to any Christians who may be watching right now may not know that at nighttime when they get on their knees and they say their prayer, they say Amen. What's the derivation of that?
Oh my goodness. Again, you've asked about what, 8 questions? Each one of those questions is a full book. When you talk about Judaism and Christianity, you're talking about ancient Egypt as a source, period. Okay. Now, we can't go into that entire subject. All right. But let's talk about Osiris. Osiris was the man who was deified, was killed, and was resurrected, and became the judge of the dead, and became the personification of resurrection for all human beings. He was also said, when the dead body of the inert Osiris, when it is buried, grain grows up out of the body. And that grain is made into what? Bread. So that bread becomes mythically the body of Osiris. Osiris was said to have discovered how to grow grapes, make wine, and spread those agricultural techniques all over the world. So the wine is supposed to be, therefore, the blood of Osiris. So when you eat the bread and the wine, you're eating the body and the blood of Osiris. And what else? There's something else I want to say about that. How could I forget this? The birthday of Osiris and Horus. Horus and Osiris were considered father and son, and they were basically conjoined sort of as father-son in a unity. Their birthday was when? December 25th. From solstice to solstice. At June 21st, the sun is at noon is at its northern extent in the summer solstice. At height, it's right above. It's at its height. Therefore, it's at its greatest strength. And then slowly, as it makes its way down the ecliptic, days get shorter and shorter and shorter till you get to December 22nd. Yeah, 21st, 22nd, which is about the solstice. The sun then stays at the solstice for 3 days. The summer, I'm talking about the winter solstice at its lowest extent. And then early on the morning of the 25th, it begins its rise on the ecliptic. So the sun, the sun, Osiris Horus, is born on the 25th. It doesn't, wait a minute, we're not finished. That's his first birth. It rises on the ecliptic until it gets to March 21st, which is coming up. The ecliptic is the plane of Earth's movement around the sun, which is like that. But then the Earth's equator is tilted just because Earth's axis is tilted. Okay, but there's a celestial, earthly equator and a celestial equator. What happens is on its movement up on the ecliptic, the sun reaches a point where the ecliptic crosses the celestial equator, and that's on March 22nd, 1st and 22nd, the equinox. It stays there for 3 days, and then it is crossified at that point. And the sun also passes over at that point. And then the sun's light, the light of the sun becomes greater, the day becomes greater than night. So the sun is reborn after that.
Wow.
We're not finished. We're not finished. Easter happens on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the equinox. The full moon, the moon is also a symbol of Osiris. So Easter, the first Sunday of the first full moon after the equinox. So what is one of the symbols of Osiris? The bunny rabbit. The Easter bunny is Osiris. We're not finished. We're not finished. One of the symbols of the sun, Ra or Horus, is the Bennu bird. And so when there's the new birth of the sun, the Bennu bird breaks out of the solar egg. And it comes out as the solar chick. The chicks of Easter. And the egg of Easter, the golden egg of Easter is the sun, and the silver egg of Easter is the moon. All this comes from Kemet.
Yes.
We haven't even talked about Christmas. We won't even talk about Christmas anymore. We won't even talk about the Christmas tree and all that.
Yes, indeed. I really appreciate it, and you know, to folks that are watching right now, and this information is very new to them. What maybe a surprise to them that this is just tipping the iceberg. This is just the tip of the iceberg. And I want to, the last thing I wanted to say to you and to ask you is because this is the tip of the iceberg, and I've read, a couple of your books, and I've seen, so many lectures of yours. This information is all accessible on your website, and I would hope that anyone that's intrigued by this, understanding that this is the tip of the iceberg, all the stuff that you get into, that you got into this on this interview, you delve into in very meticulous fashion, detailed. You get into the origins of Christmas in your works as well. How do people say, okay, I'm sold? Where can I get a hold of this man's information? Because I, like you, don't want to send people to Amazon. I'd rather send them directly to your website so they can buy it right from the source. How do people get a hold of your work, your written work, as well as you have audio?
That's right, audio tapes. That's right.
Tapes
and
well.
and DVDs also.
Where?
Again, we said at the outset, and saying again, it should be simple to remember. www. You remember that. Just remember Charles S. Finch. If you can remember Charles S. Finch, all one word, all lowercase, www.charlessfinch.com. You will find my books, my DVDs, tapes, and access to applying for the Gift of the Nile tour between July 4th, and August 4th of this coming year. All of that's on the website, as you suggest. Also, I might also mention, we've been doing webinars, by the way, since December. We've done 7 webinars on various subjects, many of which we touched on today. You can actually access those webinars as well. So almost everything that's been produced, our company is called Kenti Publications, Inc. Kenti, remember I used that word at the beginning. Kenti is the ancient Egyptian word for first, south, chief, and top. Okay, so it means the first of things, and things that come from the south. That's also the name of our publishing company, Kenti Publications, Inc. But www.charlessfinch.com, and you can access all of this if you're interested in what we've talked about today.
So even the past webinars that you've done,
yes,
now are as well. That's awesome. I want to thank you so much. Number one, for your time, because I know that you're very, very busy, and I appreciate your time. Giving it to Your World News and our vast audience, and folks that are watching right now, please visit Dr. Finch's website. And I'll say this, I'll say this on my own, that he's a living legend. I mean, we have to tap into, and I mean that with 100%, sincerity and clarity. I really, really mean that. We often talk about, the greats of like John Henrik Clarke and Ivan Van Sertima, who are no longer with us right now, and we have to delve into their work. But when we have folks that are, living, breathing historians that have covered the vast amount of space that you have covered, so that we can get in tune with history and not mythology that is we're bombarded with on a day-to-day basis. We have to tap into that work. So I appreciate the webinars and the audios, which I've have visited, and I'm going to download some more. So I appreciate your time and your work, and
thank you so much.
Look forward to continuing to support you in any way we here at Your World News can.
And may your wisdom continue.
Thank you so much. That is the great Dr. Charles S. Finch. And I'm Solomon Kamajan. You've been watching Critical Insight on Your World News, the place where journalism and activism are not mutually exclusive. Take care. Yeah. Thank you. That was great. I'm going to get on that. That was, amazing. I'm going to get on that right now. And I think, God willing, I should be able to get it done, before the end of the day.
Okay, that's fine.
For first person, I'll send the link to.
Okay, so you cover, I guess, all of Metro DC then.
Yeah, done interviews with folks on the ground in Joburg and Cape Town, South Africa, Great Britain. So, thanks to technology, I'm able to get folks by video, and if not, we have a radio show that we do as well. And I'm also friends with Jared Ball, who you were on his show a few weeks ago. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. Good. Thanks a lot. And we'll stay in touch.
Definitely. Take care.
All right.